Good morning, welcome. I was asked by Scotty to introduce this young man who's going to speak with us today. In 2008, Karen and I moved our membership up here with two small children, thinking this would be a pretty good fit, and now we know that it was. Tanner was in the youth group here many years. He was a camper and a counselor at Camp Wiregrass, a 2019 graduate of Lawrence County High School. He's currently a senior at Auburn University. His probably, what I would guess would be his most proud accomplishment is he's the fiance of Lauren Hopper, who is another longtime member here at Moulton with strong family ties. And with that, I'll give you today's speaker, Tanner.
Thing working? Am I on? I think so. Thank you to everyone who has allowed me to be here to this point. For the elders, thank you for thinking of me, and the deacons for thinking of me in this moment to be here. It is a special place. It is home. Just to do a few housekeeping things really fast. Some of you may be wondering, why didn't I sit with my dad while he was sitting up here? Well, I wanted to sit close to Brad, because I know this congregation loves Brad. I wanted to kind of take in a little bit. But then I remembered Brooke was actually in charge. She's the boss, so I sat by her instead. So there's that. Thank you all for coming. To all of our visitors, I know we have a free meal. Free meals mean cheap entertainment. You know, that's what it is. I'm up here. But no, for real, thank you very much. As we get into the lesson, and you can see we don't have the PowerPoint pulled up yet because I want to kind of preface this a little bit, but I want you to take a look at your hands. I want everybody to stop what they're doing for a minute and look at your hands. And, you know, you can put your Bibles down for a minute. If you're holding small children, that's probably not a good idea. Don't drop them. But look at your hands and look at the scars, the stories that your hands tell. I know on my hands, I've got all of my stories come from my right thumb on my hand, in case you're wondering. I've got a scar from where a hot iron fell off the ironing board, clipped me on the way down. I've got it looks kind of like a tattoo, but it's really where a pencil left its lead in me. It's probably not a good thing to still have that there, but you can see it. I've got a scar across my thumb where I almost cut it off, team roping one time, and then this huge knot that I have no idea where it came from. I know if you're somebody like my dad, his hands look a lot different than mine. He's older, he works outside and with a lot of big equipment a lot harder than I do. If you're Ross, your hands smell of tractor oil and grease. I mean, that's just what it is. He uses it as lotion. I mean, I don't know what else you can say. But our hands tell a story. And if y'all want to go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint, and let's get started with that. Today, we're going to be talking about the hands of God. We're going to be doing it from kind of the perspective that Brad, I know he kind of was going last week when I was here, and that's another thing, you know, I'm here a lot, but this is homecoming, and I'm so happy to be here. So if you're tired of seeing me, I'm sorry. You know, I graduate. I may not be able to come home as much, but I know I'm here a lot as it is. But Brad last week was talking about using these moments in Scripture and seeing the visualization, the imagery of these different things. He did a vineyard last week. And we're kind of going to take this same approach with the hands of God. And I will admit, there's a lot of points here, and it's going to seem like a lot, but we're not going to dig too deep into this. What I want to do is guide you through these thoughts that I have been presented over the past few months, and then whatever you feel out of that, I want you to be able to take it, run with it, and go with it on your own this week, this month, this year, whatever you may feel. But we're going to get into it, and I think I've got this on right. Let's see. Our hands, they tell a story. Our hands show our experiences. They show trauma, as we've talked about. And our hands show our past. And our past tells a lot of stuff. And like I said, we're going to do this through the same way as with God, as we just looked at our hands and we see our stories. We're going to look at the hands of God and see maybe His stories, His history, his characteristics. And we're going to look at those characteristics today. And I've got 7 characteristics we're going to look at through the hands of God. And I hope this doesn't become too much for you, but we're going to go through this quickly so that we can all go eat a warm meal. But we're going to start with creation. Let's see, well, I'm hitting it too fast. We're going to start with creation and God's handiwork. And as you can see, we're going to look at Ephesians 2:10, and what I'm going to call our main verses, the main point of our lesson will be on the screen. And then we'll have a few support verses, as I like to call them, that we will actually turn to in our Bibles. But this first verse we're going to look at with God's handiwork is Ephesians 2:10. And this one will be from the NIV version. The rest will be from the ESV, English Standard Version. But it says, "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." We are God's handiwork. And as we're going to look at next, we're going to look at Genesis 2, chapter 7. And as many of you know, this verse tells us about God forming the first man. And in Genesis 2:7 it says, "Then the Lord God formed the man," formed, that's the key word here, formed the man out of the dust of the ground. And he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. And then a few verses later we see that God put the man to sleep and actually took a rib. And growing up I always thought of this like surgical procedure where God lays him down. There's a surgical table in the Garden of Eden. He's cutting on him, taking it out. But we see this imagery of God using his hands to form man. And we see that with us as well. I mean, we are part of this handiwork. And we see it again in a different kind of form in Romans chapter 9. And that's where we're going to go next. And in Romans 9, we see this kind of idea that we are created by God and we are his workmanship as jars of clay. And as you can see in our verses right here, Romans 9:20 through 21, that someone is talking to God, or we're talking, and Paul's speaking here, and he says, "But why does he still find fault?" This is coming from 19. "For who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God?" And this is where we see this imagery of him using his hands. He says, "Will what is molded say to its molder, 'Why have you made me like this?' Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use?" And we're not going to get into the nitpicky stuff of these verses and things, like predeterminism and that kind of stuff. We're going to look at God using his hand. And the clay, he takes us and he forms us with his hands. And we are like clay. And so we see in this first point that God creates. This is one thing that God uses his hand for. One characteristic, God creates. On to the next one. And now we see, I'm scooting again too fast. There we go. Coverage. We're going to look at coverage now. And many of you will recognize this passage. This comes from Exodus chapter 33. And we're talking about Moses. And Moses is up on the mount with God, talking with him. And in this chapter we see, or in this verse we see that, "And the Lord said, Behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take my hand away, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." And so here again we see this imagery of God using his hand for coverage. And as we keep looking, we'll see that, and I want you to recognize this, that when he says he covers Moses in the cleft, recognize that the cleft is a place for those who want to see God. He puts Moses is in this place because he wants to see the glory of God. And that's why he's in this cleft. These are for this place, this cleft is for those who are actively seeking God out. And so what we see, and I don't know how big that is behind me, God promises to cover Moses in the cleft. And we see that he says he will cover him with his hand. And what this means really for us is that God covers anyone in the cleft that is actively seeking Him out. I don't know if you just saw, but our next verse is going to come from Psalm chapter 3. And as we turn there really fast, and many of you know this as well, but we see, but you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. And I want you to pick this. He is a shield. He provides protection and covers us from what is in front of us. And we keep seeing this imagery of God covering us throughout the Word. Next, we'll look at Isaiah in chapter 41. And in Isaiah 41, verse 10, he says, "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." And again, we know, the right hand of God is Jesus. But what I want you to see here is this imagery again of the hand, of God's hand being the one to cover us. And then finally, and I think this is the one slide where we have the most information coming from, but we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And then in verse 13, we see that that Paul is saying to the Corinthians, "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful. He will not let the temptation, or God will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, He will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it." And what I want us to see here is that God allows us to be tested, but not more than our ability. He covers us. And I'm not standing here before you saying we won't be tempted, we won't be tested. What I'm saying is what God is showing us through these verses with His hand is that He covers us. He's not going to let it be more than it can. He's going to protect us from, we call them those arrows of life, those arrows that the devil throws at us. He's going to protect us. And so with this characteristic, we see God covers us. And I want to remind you of Moses in the cleft. God covers us. And next, we have warning. God warns us with His hands. And many of you will recognize this. And I will say, this doesn't exactly say that this is God's hand in this moment, but we're going to say we know it is a hand from God. And this is in Daniel. It's in chapter 5. And it is where we see the hand coming to King Belshazzar, or Nebuchadnezzar II. And we will read this really fast. I know there's a lot to read today, and I'm trying to get through it as quick as we can so that we're not in here too long. It says, "King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. And Belshazzar, when he had tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem and be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines, they drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. And we learn later in this that this hand is from God. And it has verses 22 and 31 up there. And I'm going to not read all of those, but we're going to overview it and pick out a little bit. But we see that Nebuchadnezzar II calls in Daniel, that we've seen many times to interpret dreams and things like that. And he calls him in, and he wants him to interpret this writing on the wall. But Daniel gives him this long speech beforehand. And he tells him about how your father, the king Nebuchadnezzar I, he did the same things. He made the same mistakes, and you saw King Nebuchadnezzar II, what God did to your father, and you are doing the same things. And he said, and God is not going to put up with this. And picking up, he says, and this is coming out of verse 23, and he says, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand it is your breath, and whose are all your ways you have not honored. Then from his presence the hand was sent, And this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. And this is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And then we see in verse 30 of that reading that the king is dead that night, and Darius the Mede comes in and takes over the kingdom that he once had. But what we see in this moment, we see this hand from God, and we see warnings to the king. And we see these warnings, and he warns him. He does it through Daniel first, and he also does, or through the writing, and Daniel warns him through his speech, and then Daniel warns him about what was given through the hand of God in the writing on the wall, and it is a warning. So what does this mean for us? And I'm sure many of you can already see where we're probably going with this. But in 2 Timothy chapter 3, 1 through 5, we see warnings for us as well. And it says, "But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness, but denying its power. Avoid such people." And what we see in this verse, in these verses, we see warnings directed to us, just like the hand of God directed a warning to King Nebuchadnezzar II. And what do we see out of that? We see that God uses His Spirit to write through His people. And He creates the Bible and provides us with blessings and warnings. And in the same way, we see the hand of God, we see the Spirit of God in these writers and these people. And we literally see them write out these words that we have before us and that we're so blessed to have. And it gives us blessings, but it also gives us warnings like we just read. And so once again, another point. God warns us. God uses His hands and He warns us. We also see cleansing, though. And with the cleansing, we look to John chapter 13. And many of you also recognize this verse, but it is a lot. And it says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that His hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved His own who were in the world, He loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray Him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into His hands, and that He had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. And He laid aside His outer garments, and taking a towel, He tied it around His waist. And then He poured water into a basin, and He began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around Him. And He came to Simon Peter, who said to Him, 'Lord, do you wash my feet?' And Jesus answered him, 'What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand.' And Peter said to Him, 'You shall never wash my feet.' And Jesus answered him, 'If I do not wash your feet, you have no share with me.' And Simon Peter said to Him, 'Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head.' And Jesus said to him, 'The one who has bathed does not need to be washed, except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you. For He knew who was to betray Him. That was why He said, not all of you are clean.'" And there's a lot there, but what I want us to see is Jesus, who is God, and we recognize that. And we recognize Jesus getting down on His hands and knees, taking off His outer garment. And we see Him wash the feet of the disciples. And what we see in this is Jesus, we see God using His hands. I mean, this is Jesus. He's got carpenter's hands. They're rough. They've been beat up. He worked a lot before He started this ministry. And we see this man, probably with some gnarly hands, with the perfect hands of God, get down on His hands and knees, the authority figure, get down to His students who were considered more lowly than Him, and He washes their feet. And what does this mean for us? We cannot be part of Jesus if we are not cleansed by Him. And we have to have that cleansing from the hand of God to be part of Jesus, to be part of what He is offering, this cleansing. And Jesus cleanses the lowly, and we see that. And I think we can all admit that Jesus is far above us. He is the perfect Son of God. He is the perfect Savior and righteous man of the earth. And we thank Him so much for what He has done for us. But what does this also mean for us again? Well, I got it on the screen. John 13, 12 through 17. And we continue on, and He says, when He had washed their feet, put on His outer garments, and resumed His place, He said to them, do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, Him saying, if I, your authority figure, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given to you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. And so, what we see in this, we help clean each other's feet because Jesus cleaned us. And you know, we have these places in our world, in our country, especially where we still see, you know, foot washings and these big days at some churches and stuff. But that's not what He's getting at here. We're not actually supposed, well, I mean, we can. We're not actually supposed to walk up to everybody in this room and wash their feet. What He's saying is that cleansing can be anything from helping someone through something and giving them that strength and that power of fighting the evil that is against them, and the same thing for us. It can also be to keeping the people from those things when we recognize sin in other people's lives, and we protect them and we help them become clean because God cleanses us. So now it is our job to help cleanse others. And next we have healing, which is very similar to cleaning, but we'll see the difference here. And this comes from Matthew chapter 9, 27 through 29. And we see that, and as Jesus passed on from here, two blind men followed Him, crying aloud, have mercy on us, Son of David. And when He entered the house, the blind men came to Him, and Jesus said to them, do you believe that I am able to do this? And they said to Him, yes, Lord. Then He touched their eyes, saying, according to your faith be it done to you. And so we have this example of touching, of Jesus using His hands, taking them again, these rough hands, and actually touching their eyes. And so we see this healing power from God. And again, He touched their eyes. And then in John chapter 9, 1 through 7, we see, as He passed by, He saw a man blind from birth, and His disciples asked Him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of Him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, He spit on the ground and He made mud. And I just want you to get the imagery there of Jesus actually spitting in this dirt that He's probably walking in. So He's walking by these guys, and He takes His finger and He's just rubbing it around, and He's making this mud. And He's using His hands. I mean, this is a real life guy. I know we never got to see him alive, but this guy was real. This is God, and He's down in the mud. He's playing in the dirt. And He spits on the ground, and He makes mud with the saliva, and then He anointed. So we see Him take the mud off the ground, and we see Him rub it or, put it on the eyes of this man. And He said to him, go wash in the pool. And so he went and was washed, and he came back seeing. And so we see him make this mud and touch his eyes with his hand. And we see this healing power through the hands of God. And one more time, we see it again in Luke chapter 22, verses 50 and 51. And this is a fun story. And it says, and one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, no more of this. And He touched his ear and He healed him. And I don't know, if Jesus touched the ear, the hole that was left there from where it got cut off or what, and it closed up and it healed him, the antibacterials and disinfectants, or if He picked up the ear that had maybe fallen off or the piece and stuck it back on there. But what we see is Jesus right here in this moment, at the point of death. I mean, remember this. In this moment, Jesus is getting ready. He's leaving the garden. These are the people that have come to take him to stand trial to then go to the cross. And he knows it. He's been praying. We see that. He was sweating blood. He was so nervous about it. And we see him in this moment, even though all this is going on around him, and he still takes the time to use his hands and to heal a man. And I just wonder, I think, maybe was his hand shaking? He knew the wrath that was about to come before him. And as he did this, maybe he had a little bit of a tremor as he touched that ear. These are the hands of God that we're talking about doing these miraculous things. And the point that I want us all to get out of this, and we see again, he touched his ear to his head and it was healed. But what does this mean for us? We're not all doctors. We're not all nurses. We're not all medical professionals. And for those of you who are, you do amazing things. And I thank you for that. But not all of us can heal in that way. And this isn't what it's talking about. And what this is talking about is we can be the person that walks up to someone, put an arm around their shoulder, give them a hug, they cry with them, they sit through them, they help them through whatever they're going through, and they're being there through something with someone, helping them heal through that process. And I think that's how we see this hand of God, this healing power through the hand of God today, is by being there and loving on people who need to be healed. And what we see here is God's hands, they heal us. God heals. Moving on our last 2 points, I believe, we see salvation. And this will come from Matthew chapter 14, 22 through 35. And this was kind of, and it looks like a lot, I know, and it is a lot. This was what made me get on this topic of hands. I read this, I saw some things, and I heard some things about it, and I was like, I never thought of it through this lens, this angle. But let's read it really fast. And immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And as many of you will remember, he had just fed thousands of people miraculously. All these people had heard him preach, they'd heard him teach, they'd seen his good works. And now he puts his disciples into boats, and he dismisses the crowds, and he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. But the boat, by this time, was a long way from land. And it's in the middle of the ocean here in the sea, and it's being beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them. Jesus, he came to them, and he said, and he came walking to them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And here's the meat of what I want us to get into. And Peter was the one who answered him, and he said, "Lord, if it is your command, or if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And so Peter got out of the boat, and don't miss this, because I think we miss it so many times looking at Peter's failure in this moment. But Peter walked on the water with Jesus. And he came to Jesus. But then, when Peter saw the wind, he was afraid, and he began sinking. And he cried out, and he said, "Lord, save me." And so we see this man of great faith walk on the water, and in a moment where his faith failed him, he starts to sink. And I think we can see the parallels to our own lives in this moment. But I want you to see what happens next. And he said, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him. And he says to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why do you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." And again, just to clarify, we see Jesus stretch out his hand to save Peter. And we see that Peter had faith, and he believed in Jesus, and he walked on the water. Please don't miss that. Peter didn't get in and immediately sink because he was scared. He took 1, 2, 3, I don't know how many steps he took, but he walked on the water for a time. He had faith, but then his faith gave out and it failed. And Jesus, and you can see this, just picture it in your mind. Peter's falling, he's in the water. He's thinking, I'm about to die. And we see the hand of Jesus come down, come through the water, and it grabs Peter and it saves his life. So what does this mean for us? We have to have the faith, and we have to believe. And in our moments of failing, because we know, and the Bible tells us, and God has told us that we're humans, that we will make mistakes. But we know that Jesus, because we have had faith in Him, He's going to reach down and save us. And we have to be the ones willing to have faith in Him for Him to take that moment to save us. And then the last one, remembrance. And this ties in well with what Miles was talking about with why are we here? Why are we taking this Lord's Supper? We're here every day. Remember, it's God's hands. They remind us. And many of you will recognize this as well. This comes from John. If you couldn't tell, I love John. It comes from John chapter 20, and we know that this is where Jesus has risen from the dead, and He's presenting Himself to the disciples. And we see Him come into the room, and Thomas, who we have given the nice nickname of Thomas the Doubter, we see Thomas and Jesus in an interaction here. And now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told Him, "We have seen the Lord." But He said to them, "Unless I see in His hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of into His side and into the nails, I will never believe." 8 days later, His disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them this time. Way to go, Thomas. And although the doors were locked, nobody comes in, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then He said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." And Thomas answered Him, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and have yet believed." And so what do we see here? We see this reminder of Jesus in His hands. And God, this characteristics of God, He's reminding us. We see it through Thomas. And Thomas had to see and feel proof of the nails and the mark of the nails in his hand. And what's so miraculous about this is that, remember, the door was locked and Jesus appeared among them, and Thomas was still able to use his hands to touch the hand of God and to feel His hand in His hand. And His hands are a reminder of the things that He has done for us. And that goes back to this table that Miles covered for us this morning and talked to us about. That's where our reminder is. And we remember those nails in His hand, the nails that were pierced in the hand of God in that moment. And that is how we remember. That's how God calls us to remember. These are the characteristics of God that we see. So now the questions are, do we see the reminder when we're here, when we're not here? Do we see the reminder in the hands of God? And do we even see the hands of God at all? And just remember, He reminds us through His hands as well. And we've covered 7 points. It's been a lot, I know. And I thank you all for your attention, the time, and I hope I didn't take it too long. But now we have the opportunity where we're here as friends, as guests, as family, brothers and sisters, where we're able to recognize the hands of God in each other and in ourselves. We're able to spread that love, that healing, that comfort and salvation to one another. And we have this moment right here that we always talk about where, and in this moment, if we're not feeling or seeing or understanding the hands of God, we don't understand how those work in our lives, or we need help with the hands, we have the opportunity to come and sit up here, and we're going to do that now as we stand and sing and listen to Anthony bring us a great song.